Dr. Siegel, it's a great honor to be sitting here with you. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation of my daughter, Dr. Nellie FARNOODY, which admires you and your work. So do I. And you have influenced me personally in my practice and profession in past 15 years. Not needed to say, you are nationally, internationally known as one of the leading figures in the scientific psychology and human relationship. I'm really honored to have you in my program. Welcome to this program, and I'm sure many Iranian and Farsi-speaking population knows you through your book and your devotion to the field of psychology. Welcome to my program.
Thank you, Dr. FARNOODY. Pleasure.
Pleasure
Thank you.
having you here. Today we wanted to talk about your new book, the book that it's called Mind.
Just mind, yes.
Just Mind. How do you describe mind?
How do I describe the book or
No,
the mind?
the
The mind itself. Well, this is a really interesting question because in the field of mental health, we don't have a definition of the mind. In the field of education, we don't have a definition of the mind. And even when you think about parenting and how parents are trying to help the mind develop of a child, we don't have a definition. So for the last 24 years, I've been working with a proposed definition which sees the mind as something not just coming from your brain, which is what many people believe, but from your whole body, and not just from your body, but from your relationships with others. So it's a relational process as much as it's also an embodied process. And when you say, well, what kind of process is that? It has to get a little scientific, but there's a term called self-organization, which is a property of certain kinds of systems, like a cloud, for example, organizes itself as it moves across the sky. And I think that the mind is a self-organizing aspect of energy and information flow that happens between us and happens within us.
Talking about perception, I remember I had attended one of your very well seminars at UCLA that was relativity in perception.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really amazing. And I do remember you had a picture you had a slide in the background, which was an elephant in the room and many blind
Oh, yes.
blind man, which that's a story from Rumi, Iranian great poet, that our perception is totally related to our experience of the world. How this perception is influencing the mind?
Well, I think one of the reasons I like to show that slide is because the work I think we all need to do is to draw on the wisdom from different perspectives and bring them together. So that was one way of using that view. You know, if you have a perception of a person as all bad, then when you think of them, you'll think in terms of bad ways that they are. You will, no matter what the incoming perceptual things are, you will constantly shape them by your preconceived ideas. So part of, I think, what's important, for example, as a parent, is to understand what your expectations for your child are, but then realize that for you to really give your child the optimal kind of parenting they deserve, you have to go before your judgments and try to see your child for who your child is. A lot of problems that happen with parenting is where a parent, let's say me as a father, I say, this is how my son must be.
And I know the best.
I know the best. And my child then will not be able to grow well because they're constantly trying to fit themselves into my expectation of who they are, rather than the father or the mother seeing the child for who the child is, so the child can become the best person who they are, rather than just trying to become, a chameleon, a kind of lizard that adapts to the environment. So,
Well, these materials are going to shake Iranian parenting for sure.
parenting all around the world. It's a
Parenting.
different way of parenting, but the science is very clear about it.
Clear about it. Talking, go
Yes,
ahead.
can I add one thing to what you just said? If you think about it this way, a little child whose way of being raised is just to please their parents and not know who they are inside of themselves can make it so that the child doesn't learn an internal compass, an internal guide. So as they go through the ever-changing world, they're continually trying to please others. So that's one thing. And a related thing was I was just speaking at some high schools up in Silicon Valley, and unfortunately they've had many adolescents kill themselves. And the question is why? And one of the things we were talking about was the pressure to just meet the expectation of a number. Like,
And Silicon Valley.
yeah, a grade point average, standardized test scores, how competitive the college they get into is. And if they don't meet those numbers,
They feel failure.
they feel like a failure and they feel ashamed of who they are. So the majority of children will feel like they're failing because only certain numbers will get the highest score, of course. And so the attitude of the parents who I was speaking to makes all the difference on whether a child feels good about who he or she is or feels like a failure. That is something parents
And
can shape.
probably this is more an issue in highly competitive society. Probably children in the rural area are better off.
Well, you would think so, but I was teaching in Myanmar, old Burma, right? And I was on actually a television show there. And during the break, they said, "This is a very terrible day." I said, "Why is today a terrible day?" And they said, "Because the standardized test scores come out today, and many teenagers will kill themselves,
Oh,
even in Myanmar." So this happens, now
All
maybe
over.
those were a competitive society because there's only a limited number of spaces, but this is something for all parents to realize. And the parents in Silicon Valley I was speaking to were terrified that their child would not have a kind of internal strength, so that if they don't get a good score, they might try harder, which would be good, instead of killing themselves, which would be bad. So the parents saw this as not just, oh, I think I'll change my parenting a little bit, but sometimes a matter of life and death.
and it's an awakening.
An awakening.
It's an awakening.
Totally. So this is why it's important to share
Okay.
the
Okay,
perspective. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Dr. Siegel, talking about that relativity in perception and the chaotic mind and rigid mind. I've been the victim of this rigidity for past 3-4 weeks after the election. Honestly, I have lost sleep. My mood has shifted, and many of my clients, they come to me and they just talk about this anxiety, this sense of helplessness, this sense of betrayal and fear. What is your remedy to process this?
Yes. Well, in the view of the mind as a self-organizing process, that suggestion points to optimal well-being coming from what's called integration. And integration is honoring differences, but then promoting linkages.
Integration at the same time differentiation.
Yeah, so it's differentiation and linkage,
Linkage.
equals integration.
Okay.
Yeah, so you differentiate, honor
Okay.
differences, and then promote connections.
Connection.
And that overall process of differentiating and linking is called integration.
Integration.
Yeah.
It is really interesting because even that day that I was in your lecture, it reminded me of two concepts that Rumi uses. Exactly the same concept. Rumi talks about self-development, of course, in spiritual processing, and he talks about integration, which he calls it vasl,
Vasle.
and then differentiation that he calls it fasl.
Vasle.
Vasl, coming together, differentiating, fast. And he calls it lifetime ongoing processing.
Yes, beautiful. Can you send me that?
I
I'd love to see
definitely
that.
will.
Yes.
The book called Rumi, the gist of Rumi was translated by Coleman Barks.
Oh yeah, I have that one.
You have
the
that
Essential
book.
Rumi.
Essential of Rumi. Yes, he talks about this vast and fast. I'll send you the article about it. Very beautifully written.
Beautiful. So here's the next thing to say. When integration is present, you get a harmony. Basically, you get very flexible, adaptive. What I think is health, well-being, is from integration. But when you don't have integration, you go to either chaos or rigidity. And we can talk about what that means, but I don't know if you want to translate that part, but
Okay.
because then I'll say, I think
Beautifully
what's
said.
happening in our world now, and especially our country. So that's the first
Chaos
part.
or,
Or rigidity. So now just to say a couple of things. We are born into a body that has a long evolutionary history. And part of that history of being human is that we grew up in very small communities. So let's say I grow up with people in community A. They live in a cave, cave A. Those are my people, maybe 100 people. Then there are people in cave B. They're not my people. So maybe we get along, but when food is scarce or there's threat that's going on, then what happens in our human brains is we increase what's called in-group, out-group distinction. So we take care of people in our cave A group, but then we are very frightened of people and opposed to people in B, and maybe we even kill them. So this is, unfortunately, we've evolved with a long, long history of in-group, out-group survival.
Insider, outsider.
Insider, outsider, and when we're threatened, the research shows, when we are threatened, it increases this distinction. And once we translate that, then I'll say, I think what's gone on, not just in the United States, but all around the world. And it's, it's this in-group, out-group dynamic is not just about skin color or religion. It can be very subtle. For example, in Rwanda, the people were living together from slightly different backgrounds, and then like that, something changed, and people were then killing people who had been taking care of their children. It was a terrible, terrible thing. But human beings do this all around the planet. And so what we need to think about is how to rise above that. So what I think is happening with your reaction to the election is not just maybe you wanted one person, the other person won, but there is, as you can see with all the hate crimes that are emerging in the last 3 weeks, there is almost a validation that being in the in-group, you'll be protected, and being in the out-group in the United States, you're in danger. And we've been seeing this playing out. And I think the reason a lot of people are losing sleep is because we all can feel that this is in our genetic history. It's what we've evolved to have.
Wow.
But a civilization needs to rise above these animal instincts that we have. Being a human is more than just responding to your innate in-group, out-group distinctions. And I think that's why people are so anxious and upset, is they don't feel safe.
Well, your anticipation in next 4 years, the possibility to raise above it is more or less?
I think, you know, there's a beautiful term by a wonderful teacher named Arthur Zions, who was the president of the Mind and Life organization, and he's a quantum physicist, a retired professor. And Arthur Zions has a beautiful term called pervasive leadership. And what he means by that is we don't just look to the president to be our leader, or, you know, certain people in communities to be leaders. Pervasive means everyone takes on leadership. So my own personal reaction to this election is that more than ever before, we need to inspire people to have pervasive leadership, to realize that compassion is much more important than discarding people not like you, that being respectful to differences, embracing differences is much more important than just simplifying things and saying these people are good and those people are bad. So for my own feelings in terms of trying to not become chaotic and not become rigid. I try to see how we can use this opportunity, because history, you know, history does not go in a straight
Absolutely.
line. It zigs and it zags, as President Obama has reminded us and historians remind us all the time. So I think we can use the communications that have happened from this election, from what happened in Britain. There are lots of things happening all over the world, to say, okay, how do we inspire individuals to raise children, for example, in terms of parents, or to treat each other in the small ways we do in our neighborhoods, and the larger ways we do maybe if we are in a position of being in a government policy creation position, to say, you know something, we can be empowered to honor the values of respecting not just human life, but all life.
Absolutely.
So, for example, when you look at climate change issues and the Paris Accords, the idea of removing the United States from those agreements is an example of disrespecting other species, disrespecting other animals, disrespecting plants, disrespecting Earth. So it can get you very agitated. We need to realize that there are a lot of wonderful, compassionate, respectful, integrated human beings on the planet, and we need to inspire each other to have pervasive leadership, to make this way of living an integrated life above our in-group, out-group distinctions, and use this as a moment of saying we'll get more motivated to do that.
Great, greatly said. I know many people probably love to ask a question from you. Our lines usually opens to public. Hello?
Hello.
Yes?
Yes, I would like to ask a question from Dr. Siegel, please.
Yes, please go ahead.
I appreciate it. Hello?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Oh, okay. Am I on the air?
Yes, yes, you are.
All right, thank you. Dr. Siegel,
Yes.
talking of kids and parenting, what do you think about the kids, due to the fact that there has been a lot of bad training about kids and the way that they get hurt in different shapes and reasons? What do you think if the authority, like state or government or in socialist systems, they take control of the training of the kids with scientific methods and human methods? Of course, the parents should have access 24 hours to their kids. What is your opinion about this? Was it clear?
If I understand your question, what is my view on whether parents should be raising children or the government should be raising children?
Yes.
Yes.
For instance, officially in the United States, like the state of Texas that I'm here, the children are regarded as the children of the state first and then their parents. But I would like more than that, practically, for good state to take control of the training of children.
Well, if I'm understanding your question correctly, I mean, the science behind this is that, we evolved as children to be raised by not just a mother, but by more than one caregiver. So it's called alloparenting, but it means that the baby or young child will have a relationship with one or two or maybe three individuals who are their attachment figures. And there are many different ways of approaching parenting. When it's been looked at across different cultures, there are common grounds to it, which is basically that it's about the connection, the relationship between the child and the caregiver, the parent.
Sure.
It's the consistency of it. There are 4 S's. It's how the child is seen, the mind is seen beneath behavior, how they're safe, where they're not being threatened by the caregiver, but they're protected from harm, and also where they're soothed. So that's usually done best by parents or other caregivers who are in a parenting role. So that's not really the job of a bureaucratic government to be doing that. On the other hand, I can say as a child psychiatrist, there are some situations, where the parents in charge of the child are addicted to drugs or are sexually abusive or physically abusive or emotionally abusive. And there, in a civilized society, it's the responsibility of the society to protect those young children from abusive parents. So in that situation, then what we have are important ways where the government must intervene to protect the well-being of a child who's being mistreated.
Dr. Siegel, probably the last question. I do remember in one of your seminars, somebody asked you, what is the difference between brain and mind? Is it the same?
Yeah. Well, since the time of Hippocrates, 2,500 years ago, a Greek physician, we have said that mind, all your feelings, your thoughts, your joys, your sorrows, come from the brain alone. This has been repeated many, many times. So it might be true that mind is simply complex brain activity. But in my experience as a professional, my view as a scientist, and my experience as a person, the mind is much more than what happens in your head. That it's fully embodied and it's also in your relationships with others. So, for example, when I study parent-child relationships, I see the mind as not just being shaped in the child's brain, but actually emerging in the connection. So this is not the usual way we combine brain science with relational science, but it's a way of understanding culture, communities, families, and even one-to-one relationships that we have with our children or with our significant others in our lives. So for me, the mind is an emergent process of energy and information flow that is not restricted to the head. It's happening in the whole body and in our relationships with each other. So in that way, the difference between the mind and the brain is that the brain is an organ up in your head. The mind is energy and information flow that, yes, is in your head, so it includes the brain, but it includes the whole body, like your heart. And your intestines, and it includes the betweenness as much as the withinness.
So you're talking about chakras.
Well, chakras in the body, but also the relational connections we have.
It's oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and one more thing, in this book, Mind, that you mentioned earlier, I do a very careful invitation for the reader to explore their own experience. And what arises from that is the view that if the mind is emerging from energy and information flow, then what you're going to get is you're going to get this experience of it happening throughout the whole body, so you can check in with your bodily experience, maybe the chakras. But also, if it's self-organizing, what it tells you is that integration will be the pathway to creating well-being. And that integration happens, yes, in the brain, but it happens in the whole body, and you can create it, and in your relationships. And finally, the thing to say is that if the mind were the same as the brain, then the brain would be in charge. But you can use your mind to actually change your brain. And we've done studies at UCLA to prove that that's true. And from a practical point of view, it's the exact way therapy works, it's the exact way parenting works, that our relationships are stimulating the growth of the brain in an integrated way.
Is it safe or is it wise to say that probably mind is a wiser brain processing?
You could say that. Yeah, I think that would be a way that wisdom arises from the brain's activity, but includes the heart, the intestines, and your relationships. So in a way, it's a larger process than just what happens in your head.
It was really great to have you. I hope you would have much more years in your life to contribute to humanity and psychology. And what you've done so far is amazing, but I wish you many, many, many more years to come.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Wonderful to be here.